Your dog notices more about you than you think, and most of it happens in moments you don't even register. Not in big dramatic events, but in small repeated actions that quietly define your behavior every day. The way you move, the way you pause, the way you react when nothing important seems to be happening. And over time, those moments become the way your dog understands you. Because dogs don't rely on words the way humans do. They rely on patterns that repeat consistently. What happens again and again becomes meaningful, while anything inconsistent becomes something they need to evaluate. That's why your dog is always watching, even when it seems relaxed or uninterested. It is constantly tracking what stays the same and what changes. And those observations don't stay as passive information. They turn into expectations. Your dog begins to anticipate what you will do next based on what you have done before. That anticipation is what creates fast responses and smooth interaction. But when those patterns begin to shift even slightly, the response begins to change as well. The first thing your dog notices is how you move before anything else happens. You stand up, shift your weight, or take a step, and your dog is already reacting to that movement. It is not waiting for a command, it is reading your body in real time. Because movement is often the first signal your dog responds to, not your voice. When that movement is consistent, your dog responds instantly without hesitation. When it becomes inconsistent, even in small ways, your dog begins to slow down. That slowdown is not resistance, it is processing. And that processing is where hesitation begins to form. The next thing your dog notices is your timing, not just what you do, but when you do it. You call your dog, but sometimes there is a delay before anything happens, and other times the response leads to something immediately. That difference may feel small to you, but to your dog it creates a pattern. And that pattern determines how quickly your dog reacts. If your timing is predictable, your dog moves without thinking because it already knows what follows. If your timing varies, your dog begins to wait before responding. That waiting is not confusion, it is adjustment. And that adjustment is what turns a reflex into a decision. Your dog is also watching where your attention goes, even when you are not aware of it. What you focus on, what you react to, and what you ignore all send signals. Your dog uses those signals to understand what matters in the environment. And over time, it aligns its behavior with what you consistently pay attention to. If your attention is steady, your dog stays aligned with you naturally. If your attention shifts unpredictably, your dog begins scanning the environment more. That scanning introduces distance between you and your dog. And that distance changes how quickly your dog responds to you. And this is where most owners begin to feel something shift, even if they cannot clearly explain it. Not because one moment stands out on its own, but because multiple small moments begin to connect into a pattern. What once felt automatic now feels slightly delayed and slightly less certain. And that difference is where behavior begins to change. Your dog is also watching how you react when something interrupts your routine. A noise, a distraction, or something unexpected reveals more than your normal behavior ever does. Because in those moments, your consistency is tested, and your dog is paying close attention to how you handle it. If your response stays steady, your dog remains steady with you. If your response changes, your dog adapts to that change. And that adaptation carries forward into future behavior. Because your dog is always learning from what actually happens, not what is supposed to happen. Repetition is another thing your dog tracks very closely, especially when it comes to behavior. If something is repeated multiple times before anything changes, your dog begins to adjust its expectations. It learns that the first signal may not matter, and that waiting is part of the pattern. And once waiting becomes part of the pattern, response slows down. This is not disobedience, it is learned timing. Your dog is responding to the pattern it has experienced repeatedly. And that pattern shapes how quickly it reacts moving forward. Because behavior always follows what has worked before. Your dog also notices how emotionally consistent you are across situations. Not your mood in isolation, but whether similar situations lead to similar responses. That consistency is what creates predictability. And predictability is what allows your dog to respond without hesitation. If your reactions are stable, your dog moves quickly because it understands what to expect. If they vary, your dog begins to slow down and observe more. That observation creates a delay between signal and action. And that delay changes the entire feel of the interaction. Another thing your dog notices is what actually happens after you act. Not what you intend, but what follows through consistently. Whether your actions lead to something clear or fade without meaning. Because follow-through is what gives your behavior weight. When your actions consistently lead somewhere, your dog responds instantly. When they do not, your dog begins to question what matters. And that questioning introduces hesitation into the system. Not emotionally, but structurally. This is where everything starts to connect into a single pattern. None of these moments exist on their own. They build on each other over time. Your dog is not reacting to one thing. It is responding to everything combined. And that combined pattern determines how your dog behaves before you even realize it. Because from your dog's perspective, behavior is not about isolated events. It is about what repeats, what stays consistent, and what leads to clear outcomes. When those elements are stable, response is automatic. When they shift, response becomes conditional. This is where behavior stops being reactive and starts becoming selective. Your dog is no longer moving instantly based on habit. It is now processing what it sees and deciding what makes sense in the moment. And that decision-making process is what introduces hesitation. Once that hesitation appears, it does not stay limited to one situation. It begins to spread across different behaviors because the underlying structure has changed. The dog starts applying the same evaluation to movement, attention, and engagement. And that is where the overall shift becomes visible. And this is why the change feels confusing to most owners. Because nothing dramatic has happened, yet everything feels slightly different. The dog still responds, still follows, and still engages, but not in the same automatic way. And that difference is what people are sensing. Because what has changed is not the behavior itself, but the system behind it. The dog is no longer relying on reflex, it is relying on interpretation. And interpretation takes time, even if that time is only a moment. But that moment is enough to change how the interaction feels. And once that structure is in place, it continues reinforcing itself. Each moment of hesitation confirms the pattern, and each repeated pattern strengthens it. Until what once felt like a small variation becomes the new normal. And by that point, the shift is no longer subtle. But it all leads back to the same foundation. Not a single moment, but a series of small signals your dog has been reading all along. Signals that seemed insignificant on their own, but together created a clear direction. And that direction is what shapes how your dog responds now. Because the difference between instant response and hesitation is not obedience, it is clarity. And clarity is built from everything your dog sees in you, every single day. And this is where the difference becomes impossible to ignore over time. Because what started as a small delay begins to shape how every interaction feels. The dog is still there, still responsive, but the timing is no longer aligned in the same way. And that subtle shift changes the entire rhythm between you. Because when a dog is fully aligned with you, there is no gap between signal and response. Movement happens together, without hesitation, without evaluation, without delay. But when that alignment changes even slightly, a space begins to form. And in that space, the dog is thinking instead of moving. That thinking is what most people don't realize they're seeing. It looks like hesitation, but it's actually decision-making. The dog is comparing what it has learned with what it is seeing in that moment. And once that process becomes part of the behavior, it does not stay small. Because decision-making spreads. It moves from one behavior into others, shaping how the dog responds across different situations. What began as a small pause becomes a consistent pattern, and that pattern becomes the new way the dog interacts with you. And this is why the smallest moments matter the most. Not because they are dramatic, but because they are repeated. And repetition is what builds structure and behavior. Not intention, not emotion, but what happens again and again. So when your dog watches you before moving, or pauses before responding, or stays back instead of following, it is not random. It is the result of everything it has been observing over time. A reflection of patterns that have slowly taken shape. And once you see that clearly, the moment changes. It is no longer confusing or frustrating. It becomes something you can recognize immediately. Something that tells you exactly where your dog's understanding stands. Because in the end, your dog is not reacting to what you say. It is responding to what it has learned to expect. And that expectation is built from everything it notices, every single day.